Okay, let's get going. I see over 30 people have arrived. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Jeff Loiter. I am a technical director at the Center for Partnerships and Innovation, or CPI as we call it. We are NARUC's technical assistance group. I'm sure many of you are familiar with us. And the way that we do our work is in part through webinars and building relationships and developing resources to assist state commissions with current and emerging issues, and we know that resilience is certainly a current issue. We're funded by cooperative agreements with several offices in DOE, and this webinar is part of a work stream on resilience that's supported by the Grid Deployment Office. So we thank them for their support for this and many other resources that we are able to provide. One of those other resources is a recently published resilience framework. And that is something that we did a workshop on at our recent Summer Policy Summit. And Commissioner McKissick will reference briefly, and we will put a link to that in the chat. We think that's a valuable resource, and we're hoping to get that promoted and get people using it and benefiting from it. I very much want to thank Nina Suataki from NASUCA for helping to plan and organize this webinar. Truth be told, Nina did most of the work and on short notice, and I'm certainly grateful for her support and for the partnership that we have with NASUCA in a number of areas. We really do believe in collaborating with our fellow N groups, as we call the various associations of state agencies whose members also work on issues of utility regulation in energy. And it's one of our really key strategies for how we do that. So one of the other ways we do that is through our National Council on Electricity Policy, or NCEP. We'll put a link to that in there. And there's a number of publications that I think are relevant to this context, including one about state agency coordination and another about how utility commissions and consumer advocates can work together to discharge their duties and protect the public interest. So I'll give Nina a moment to say a few words, and then we'll get going into the substance.
Thank you, Jeff. My name is Nina Suratake, and I'm the Deputy Director of Policy for NASUCA, which is the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates. We're an association of 62 member offices across 45 different states, and we really appreciate this opportunity to work with NARUC to present this webinar, and I thank our member head offices who were very thankful that you all volunteered to help me with this. And I'm really looking forward to this. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Nina. I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner McKissick from the North Carolina Utilities Commission. He was first appointed in 2019, and he has served as chair of the NARUC Committee on Consumers and the Public Interest since 2023. So the issue of protecting consumers is one that he has been engaged in and lending his energies to for quite a while. I thank him for agreeing to moderate this on very short notice during a very busy time shortly after our Summer Policy Summit. We really appreciate his joining us today. So with that, Commissioner McKissick, I'll hand it over to you to kick things off. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jeff. And I'd like to thank the entire team with NARUC and NASUCA who are work together collaboratively to pull together this particular webinar. I think the focus is very relevant, looking at electric systems resilience from a consumer perspective, and we have a great team of panelists today that will focus attention on doing that. And I would like to reference that particular study that NARUC published. It was several months ago, it goes back to February or March, and it's titled Resilience Framework. And what it tends to do is to pull together information that state regulators and other key stakeholders can use with a structured approach for considering policies and programs that will enhance grid resistance amid an evolving situation where we have technological changes, environmental changes, economic challenges, and how do you go about working and tearing down perhaps traditional silos to go about setting goals and objectives, and sharing information and establishing an inclusive process to address issues related to resiliency. Sometimes people get confused with resiliency and reliability, and resiliency is really looking at those episodic type of conditions, whether you're talking about changing weather patterns or cyber attacks or the composition of the electrical grid and diversity of equipment that's connected to the grid. And, how do you do that looking at it on those type of extraordinary and dynamic conditions, whereas reliability looks to more or less the more normal, traditional types of challenges that one might face. But today we're going to hear from these consumer advocates. We have Chris Ayers, who's Executive Director of the North Carolina Utilities Commission Public Staff, Michelle Beck, who's Executive Director of the Utah Office of Consumer Services, as well as Claire Coleman, Consumer Counsel of the Connecticut Office of Consumer Counsel. And with that stated, what I'd like to ask each of you, and I'm going to ask it at one time, but each of you kind of go in turn in terms of addressing it. Could you briefly introduce yourselves and tell us about the primary hazards that drive resilience planning in your state, what your state's requirements are for resilience planning, and how consumer advocates are included in resilience planning in your state? And why don't we go ahead and kick that off with Michelle Beck?
Okay, I wasn't expecting to go first. Sorry, it took me a second to get off mute. So my name is Michelle Beck, and I am in Utah, the director of the Utah Office of Consumer Services. And we are the consumer advocates. We represent residential and small commercial consumers of public utilities here in Utah. Now, in Utah, we are, I'll say, not at the forefront of the learning curve for resilience planning in any way. And I say that without disrespect to any of my colleagues, because we have a very small government philosophy here, and we don't have a lot of staff to be working on a lot of initiatives that come out in some of the other states. So we kind of watch with interest and see how some of those things develop. But unfortunately, we are in wildfire territory. And so in 2020, our legislature passed the Wildland Fire Planning and Cost Recovery Act. So a lot of the stuff that we're doing for wildfire prevention is really analogous to the same types of planning and investments that you will see in any circumstance for resilience. But ours is very much focused on the wildfire side of things. And the standard is that the legislature set for approval of any investment plan is that it be reasonable in the public interest, and it must appropriately balance cost of implementing the plan with the risks of a potential wildfire. So it does require that the commission make that finding, which then I would suggest requires that there's evidence in the record to show some kind of cost, benefit, risk evaluation. And that's been the heart of the cases to date. Now, the way our resilience here with wildfire has unfolded is that it comes through very specific proceedings of first a plan and then sort of the recovery compliance reports. And to the extent that things are approved in a plan, then they do get to come through a rider. But you can imagine we're still in early days. We've really only had two plans to date, and we haven't reached agreement, and it's been highly, highly contentious. But since it's all been formal dockets, our office has full participation rights. And I would say that we've been a very strong contributor in terms of providing evidence and input. And we appreciate that we've been acknowledged. Our contributions have been acknowledged in commission orders to date. So I think that's a good intro, and I'll turn it over to the next person.
Excellent. Chris, would you like to go ahead and chime in terms of what you're doing and working on in North Carolina?
Sure. Well, thank you, Commissioner McKissick, and pleasure to be here with you today. I've been Executive Director of the Utilities Commission Public Staff in North Carolina since July of 2013. So I've been around a little over 12 years. The public staff's consumer advocate in the state. We have staff of approximately 80 individuals, engineers, accountants, financial folks, attorneys, analysts that are responsible for investigating most everything that comes before the commission. So it's in that posture that I respond to the question. So with respect to North Carolina, our primary hazards, well, we touch on almost all of them. So hurricanes are the big ones. Those are the ones that come to mind, and those are a recurring issue for us. And Hurricane Helene last year devastated the western part of the state, but we see them in the center part of the state and damage in the east as well. So hurricanes immediately comes to mind, but North Carolina also experiences from time to time ice storms that will wipe out good parts of or take parts of the electric system down for extended periods of time. Over the last 10 years or so, we have seen our share of increasing polar vortexes that put a lot of stress on the grid. So back to, Commissioner McKissick, the way you describe resilience, and it's these high risk, low frequency events. I now lump polar vortexes in those events. And even outside of hurricanes, we have seen flooding recently, even this year in places that, got a lot of rain over a course of a couple of days and now sees flooding and impacts that we historically had not seen before. And yes, we are beginning to see just a little bit of wildfire risk in North Carolina. Not like you would see out west. I heard a stat where I think North Carolina might be number 4 in terms of the number of wildfires in the country, but a lot of those are very small, and so don't reach the level that you see out west. Nonetheless, we are talking about them now, whereas 10 years ago, the notion of wildfire in North Carolina was really, really quite a thing. I'll say that the primary hazards in North Carolina tend to show up all over the state. But here recently, they've started to show up in places that you wouldn't normally think. For example, Hurricane Helene went through and devastated the mountains. You do not think of a hurricane coming up through Florida and winding up in the mountains of North Carolina and causing the destruction that it did. But it did. 30 years ago, Hurricane Hugo went up through Charlotte. Hurricane Fran went through Raleigh. And so we have found ourselves in North Carolina dealing with primary hazards in areas that you might not necessarily expect them to be. I'll throw one other hazard in there, and everything I've talked about to this point is natural disaster. But about 2 years ago, we had an assault on the substation in Moore County in North Carolina. Someone shot up a couple of transformers, all the oil leaked out, and power was lost in that part of the state for a while. And that was a wake-up call to a lot of people. So the ability to recover from incidents like that, I put into the resilience category as well. It's just something that we've experienced here in North Carolina. North Carolina doesn't have specific requirements for resilience planning per se. It is part of the overall system plan. Duke Energy has an integrated system and operations planning protocol. We call it the ISOP here in the state. That has elements of that because we want to keep the lights on, and to the extent they go off, we want them on back as quickly as we can. The public staff's role in that process as the consumer advocate is really, as I mentioned in my the beginning of my comments, investigating the spend and the plan. We've got technical experts, so we'll look at the plan, and a lot of it is making sure that the risk and the spend are appropriately balanced. And I'll talk more about cost benefit analysis and the like as we get deeper into our discussion here. But we're at the table. We are trying to provide that constructive tension to ensure that appropriate attention is being paid to the issue, and appropriate amount of money putting to addressing the issue, but not too much. And it's that constructive tension that I think produces some good results.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate those thoughts and perspectives. And why don't we go ahead and hear from Claire Coleman?
Sure. Thanks so much, Commissioner, and thanks to NARUC for hosting this important discussion. My name's Claire Coleman. I am the Consumer Counsel for the state of Connecticut. I've been in this role since December of 2021, which is in some ways, the timing is relevant to this discussion because I came in sort of a year after the deadly tropical storm Isaias really ravaged the state of Connecticut. We had 700,000 customers losing power. I was out 7 or 8 days myself. We were under a major federal disaster declaration. And to the broader point of primary hazards that drive our resiliency planning, certainly that tropical storm made a significant impact. But we do also regularly experience high winds, snow, ice. We kind of have the best of both worlds, or the biggest challenges, depending on how you look at it. We've got beautiful coastline in Connecticut that's subject to, flooding. For example, during Superstorm Sandy, we saw a lot of damage along our shoreline. And coming inward, we've got a lot of trees. About 225 trees per resident, I believe, is a recent estimate. So a densely populated state with a lot of trees presents a very challenging circumstance for our utilities as they prepare for and respond to storms. Luckily, we have had a very proactive resiliency planning process. Actually started a little before I joined my amazing team, and it's a part of a comprehensive grid modernization initiative. But we did have a focus proceeding that lasted about 2 years that established a reliability framework and a resiliency framework. So 2 separate frameworks, but that are interconnected and are designed to work together. And I was really pleased to see the NARUC guide reference Connecticut's framework. I do believe it is sort of a leader and can serve as a model. And the framework was really designed to aid in analyzing the benefits of resiliency programs and projects, and planning and performance targets in order to ensure cost-effective both reliability and resilience planning. It has a focus on the vulnerable portions of our distribution system. And another area is looking at the type of mitigation measures, and of course, the very important benefit cost analysis, which I'll also save for later. So this framework was established in 2022 and designed to be integrated into our utilities plans through rate cases, but we do also have an annual review of the broader framework to allow for tweaks, improvements, and changes. So it's a dynamic and continually improving framework. And I am proud to say that our office, as a consumer advocates representing ratepayers in the state, did play a significant role in developing this framework. Certainly an important participant in these proceedings. We ask a lot of questions. And Chris, I love your constructive tension framing. I am going to borrow that and use it going forward. Yes, we have contributed and continue to do so on an ongoing basis. In addition to the regulatory frameworks, also participating in our emergency support functions and playing a close communication role with our utilities as they respond to storms. But I'll leave it at there. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. And Chris always has a wealth of those type of expressions that I borrow as well. Let me ask this question. What evaluation criteria or methodologies are being used to determine whether investments in resilience are prudent? I've heard 2 of you already talk about cost benefit analysis or things of that nature that come to play, but go ahead and chime in. I mean, Claire, since you were the last in the queue the last time, why don't we start with you first this time?
Sure. Yeah. So our resiliency framework does require a comprehensive benefit cost analysis for our electric distribution companies to perform. And that analysis actually uses modeling tools to simulate a reasonable set of storm scenarios to get a sense of the potential benefits from different mitigation measures. And it also seeks to prioritize different areas of the grid that are perhaps more vulnerable and need more specific resilient solution sets. And it encompasses both short-term and long-term evaluation, which I think is really important, because we often, as consumer advocates, have a really challenging task of figuring out how much we can spend now for investments that are going to bring consumers benefit in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So it's a really important part of this analysis for us to be able to evaluate who's going to see the benefit from these investments.
Now, the modeling tool that you refer to, is that something that was uniquely designed for use in Connecticut or by a specific utility, or is that something that was could be available to others if they wanted to kind of customize it or use it for their type of analysis as well in other states?
Great question. So our Public Utility Regulatory Authority, our PUC, provided the guardrails, I'd say, the framework, but it was up to the utility to bring that forward. Since the resiliency and reliability framework has been established, only one of our 2 electric distribution companies has come before PURA for a rate proceeding. So they, with the assistance of consultants, presented, what in their view was the best implementation of that. Our office did provide some constructive tension in that area to really challenge and test those benefit cost analysis assumptions and really seek to get even more granular information in order to establish, what are prudent beneficial investments. And I'd say that conversation is ongoing. So it will continue to be a work in progress.
Thank you. And Chris, you want to go ahead and chime in? The original question, should I repeat it?
So in North Carolina, we approach an investigation of resilience investment just like we do every other investment. North Carolina has a least cost planning and operations requirement. And so public staff's analysis, and I think the commission's analysis as well, is, all right, you've identified a solution to a particular issue, and have you designed the least cost path to addressing that issue? So it's a cost benefit analysis. I'll give you one example that occurred about 25 years ago. There was a major ice storm that came through North Carolina in 2000, 2001, somewhere in there, took power out for just weeks in some places, really ground the state to a halt. And so coming out of that, there was a lot of chatter and discussion about why in the world are our power lines not undergrounded? That makes sense. Trees can't fall on power lines that are underground. And so there was a study done, and ultimately the study came back with numbers that said it is incredibly expensive to underground the system, even in areas that are more likely to get ice. In North Carolina, you get ice anywhere if an ice storm's going to hit. And so, it's not localized to the mountains or something like that. And so the ultimate conclusion was it doesn't make sense to underground all of the lines because it's cost prohibitive. So, and we've had similar discussions and after incidents or episodes. The cost benefit analysis is really, it's as much art as it is science, I think, because part of the challenge is you're evaluating the impact, the value of the impact of the loss of service. Okay, so, and that's going to vary. The impact of the loss of service is going to depend on where you are on the system, where you are in the state, what customer class you're in. And so assigning that dollar value to a cost benefit analysis when you're then looking at the spend, that's not necessarily pure science. There's some subjectivity in there. So that's how we've approached it. I will tell you the other thing that we've done in North Carolina, just in terms of evaluating investment, has sort of been trying to build on our lessons learned. And so our commission has held a number of hearings over the years, whether it's a polar vortex issue or whether it's a hurricane or an ice storm, something like that. All right, bring the utilities in and say, all right, so we experienced this. And it seems like every time we have a big incident like this or an episode, it's somehow different than the ones we've experienced in the past. And so there's the known knowns, the unknown knowns, and you know that saying. And so we're constantly trying to learn from, all right, how is this different? How might this be a forecast of what we might experience in the future? And then let's design response to that with appropriate spend, build on the lessons learned, and whether it's polar vortex or snowstorm or hurricane or something like that going forward. But for us, it's the same analysis as everything else, is that the least cost path to achieve the goal, the stated goal.
Thank you, Chris. And I remember that ice storm. I was out power for 11 days. And I remember the study that followed.
Yeah.
Michelle, what are your thoughts about, I know you are facing challenges dealing with wildfires primarily, and that's been the focus and driving issue that has monopolized your time for the most part. But how your state and how do they focus upon cost benefit analysis, other methodologies that might be used to drive down to these episodic conditions and try to determine what is appropriate in terms of investments for resilience?
Right. Well, and it's funny because in a way, I'll just agree with Chris that we evaluate it the same way we evaluate everything. Is it cost beneficial from the customer perspective? And I will give you a side note. Wildfires are not the only thing that happens in Utah. I mean, we have wind events and we have ice events and winter storm events, but there's no specific resilience program addressing those. And we do have a specific wildfire program. And one thing that you may start to hear about, or certainly the Western states who are online right now might already know, is I'm seeing a lot of references to what we're calling an RSE, a risk spend efficiency. And it's really just looking at cost spend. But the other thing I'm noticing is that not everyone uses the term in the same way. So in some cases, you do the evaluation and you get a risk number, and it's just a number, and you can evaluate the relative risk or the relative benefits to reduce risk. But in other cases, it goes further, which is what we're certainly supporting as the consumer advocate. And that's where you actually look at both the risk, the reduction in the likelihood of this adverse event, so that risk in sort of a percentage term, and also the consequence of the adverse risk. And so now you've converted a relative risk number into dollars. And so it's taking you to the old-fashioned cost-benefit analysis. Do the benefits outweigh the costs, which is what we want to look for. Because unfortunately, in my limited evaluation of plans throughout the West, the utilities are oftentimes putting undergrounding first. And guess what, Chris, I know you're not going to be surprised, but also in the West, that is not found to be the most cost-effective solution from a wildfire perspective. In fact, it might be the least cost-effective solution. But it does involve capital spend and consequently earned returns. And so that's where I took a note, where the constructive tension comes into play. And so, we're really looking at all of the other things, and there's becoming a larger body of evidence so that we can look across territories and see really what are we finding common ground on. So it does, in the end, come back to good old-fashioned cost-benefit analysis.
Well, that's an excellent summary, and it keeps it very clear and succinct. I think we all understand that. And I guess the question of how we weigh it in each respective jurisdiction and how we evaluate how much we want to invest to decrease the potential impact of an event that's going to be relatively scarce or cannot always be predicted in terms of frequency from the outset. So it's challenging, but I guess that's what we all have to face as commissioners, and what has to be faced in terms of looking at consumer advocates and trying to weigh that relative tension about how you go about approaching these issues. Let me shift gears a little bit. It's a related issue, but I'm just want to hear your take on it. I mean, what kind of evaluation criteria should commissions or regulators be focused upon to ensure that these investments are prudent? I mean, understanding that we're planning for situations that are sporadic, where you cannot always predict the frequency, where you cannot always predict the severity, and yet you're trying to be prudent and use cost effective measures along the way. What are there any things that can be done to ensure that these investments are prudent in light of the fact that you clearly can't look into a crystal ball and know what's forthcoming? And Chris, we'll start with you this time.
So I think commission should be taking a lead in identifying some key variables that go into the analysis. So one example is identifying areas in your state or in your jurisdiction where extraordinary conditions tend to exist or tend to recur. So the coast is more likely to get hit by a hurricane. Your barrier islands are more likely to get hit than interior. Now, recognize there's caveats to this per my opening comments, which is in North Carolina, we've seen things that you would expect out on the coast and the mountains and everywhere else. But you've got data that can point to areas where extraordinary conditions are more or less likely to occur with more frequency than others. And so I think knowing where to look is important. Building on that, then looking at looking at circuits and looking at critical assets and identifying the frequency, the scale and scope of impact and potential solutions in these areas of, all right, what goes down, what's the cascading effect, having a heat map of your worst performing circuits, so that, all right, if there's anything that's sort of out of the ordinary that's going to occur, we know these circuits are going to have issues. That's where your analysis should probably start, and that's where your investment should probably start. Again, doing the cost benefit analysis. I've seen heat maps. North Carolina before, we've had requirements of utility needs to look at their 10 or 20 most challenging circuits every year, and they need to address them. All right, why is, and we're talking more about reliability here, but if you got reliability in these issues, resilience is probably going to be a challenge as well. So it's mapping that out. A couple of examples, relocating a substation that frequently floods when you have a high rain event, or if there's a hurricane going to be on this side of the state, we know the substation is going to flood and we've got to rebuild it. Go ahead and put together plans to relocate the thing at some point when you've got to rebuild it in the future, or even strengthening protective equipment around critical substations. Or another one that's we experienced this a week ago, really hot here in North Carolina, and someone driving up Highway 98 hit a power pole and knocked power out for hours. And one would have thought that'd been pretty easy to stand back out, but it's more complicated than one would have thought on a particularly hot day. And so, a self-optimizing grid or things like that can help reroute the power to keep power flowing in an area. Strangely, one of the biggest, I think the leading cause of power outages, at least in North Carolina, tends to be people driving into power poles. I don't remember that being a thing years ago, but apparently it's happening more and more. If we know that's a recurring reliability problem and there's a resilience component of, all right, how quickly do we bounce back from that? That seems to, be one of those data points a utility could pull together and say, all right, well, people in, Raleigh or whatever city, for whatever reason, we have higher rates of this. So how do we make sure power keeps flowing, as opposed to if someone hits the wrong one, there's a segment of people down for an extended period of time. But it's identifying the areas where is more likely to occur, and then drilling down there to figure out whether or not it's cost effective to reduce that risk and the downtime.
Very good. Claire, you like to go ahead and chime in?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I think I'll echo Chris's comments on really the importance of identifying those vulnerabilities in the grid and the specific geographic selection criteria that can help a commission focus its prudency analysis. Really, has the utility company evaluated where community needs are? Has it evaluated specific needs of environmental justice communities? Are there specific classes of customers, like commercial customers that are running a big factory, or specific customers that have medical conditions that necessitate life support equipment. All of these individual risk factors should play into sort of investment decisions and the prudency of those. And I think one noteworthy addition, it's sort of a work in progress right now in Connecticut, but I see as very complementary to our resiliency and reliability framework, is a new integrated distribution system planning framework that we're also developing. So historically, you know, as consumer advocates, we don't get involved in the proactive planning. We really see what the utilities have done in a rate case, and then we get to evaluate, you know, investments that have already been made. But with a more proactive grid planning process, we can be part of that proactive planning to really determine where grid needs are and sort of what are the extreme event scenarios that should play into that grid need assessment, which is really part of our, it's still in draft form, but contemplated to be part of that integrated distribution system planning. So I'm really excited about that, helping inform what this criteria should be even further.
Thank you. And Michelle, what thoughts do you have?
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what has been said. I want to talk about wildfire in it. And as states are entering more wildfire planning and prevention, I think you'll find that a lot of states have data on wildfire. That doesn't need to necessarily be started in a new collection of data, but you may also face what we have faced, which is that it's a very, very broad brush. So it'll be like, this is the elevated fire risk area. And so we need to refine. So that's one of my messages, is refine the data, refine. And I've seen some data out of California, which of course, I mean, and to be honest, 10 years ago, I don't know that Utah, which is just, you know, kind of a couple states away from California, I don't think we thought of ourselves as, you know, wildfire zone. And that was wrong of us, right? But California's been doing it longer than any of us. And I think that they've got it down to where line segments have different levels of risk. And so that's what I want to see. The other thing, that other twist with wildfire, is that we see what we call PSPS, public safety power shutoffs. So that is when there's a high risk, you preventively turn it off. And we also see enhanced safety settings. So that is a case where, again, elevated risk for fires, and anything hitting a line will turn it off. And sometimes those take even longer to restore power, because utility needs to go and inspect, visually inspect the entire line before turning it on to make sure that the risk is abated. And so these are things that are such a broad brush, and they also have an impact on customers, because customers are without power during hot and dry times when, you know, you really want that power. And in some cases, as Claire mentioned, folks may have a need for life-saving equipment to be on. So my biggest message here is I want to see these things refined. So it's going to be a continuous progress for, I would guess, until well after I've retired.
Yeah, and I can recall going to one of those wildfire mitigation centers out in California near San Diego and seeing all the high technology they were utilizing to monitor those areas where they thought there was a higher propensity of frequency of fires, as well as cameras, wind control monitors, you name it, 24/7. They were following and tracking it with a control center that was very, very impressive, which I don't think many states could afford to go about undertaking, without a doubt. Now, one question here, which I'm going to start out with you this time, Michelle. What aspects of resiliency planning do you think need further work or improvement? If you were thinking of just the way things are today, whether they're in Utah or other places, I mean, is there some aspect of resiliency planning that you think could really deserve further work, further explanation, further improvement to kind of help this become more effective as a tool and resource in terms of how we approach this resiliency planning?
Right. First, I want to apologize for having to go off camera here and there. Unfortunately, I'm sitting too still and my lights keep going off.
It's
Okay,
okay.
so
I've been places like that too.
Yeah,
I thought
okay,
you
so
were
it's
having resilience issues, Michelle.
no resilience issue. It's energy efficiency, aggressiveness. Anyway, honestly, Commissioner, to your point, I feel like I have raised those issues. I feel like it's refining the data and refining the methodology. We're in early stages, so maybe I'd like to turn to my colleagues and let them add some more specifics to what I've already said.
Why don't either of you go ahead and chime in, since I'm going to be looking at both of you in any case.
Sure, I'll jump in. I think one tool that we are layering on to these great planning processes that we have in place already are seeking to align utility performance incentives with our goals around resiliency, right? So we also have a performance-based regulation initiative that's going to include some metrics and scorecards. There are no current performance incentive mechanisms that have financial impacts yet on the table, because we do feel like we need some baseline data before we can get there. But there will be some important information that will be more transparently provided to the public around, historic rolling averages of all-in SAIDI scores. We have a major storm reports metric that's going to provide more transparency around the major storm impacts that our EDCs face. And the ultimate goal of our PBR framework is to utilize the metrics and scorecards to develop baselines and really be able to evaluate data. And some of those will eventually become performance incentive mechanisms where the utility can get either an upside or downside adder or subtractor. I do think that's a beneficial tool that commissions can use to ensure that the utilities are moving in the same direction they want to be.
Excellent. Chris, what are your thoughts?
I think my suggestions are a little more conceptual. One, I mentioned that sort of the heat maps of where do we have recurring problems, where we have those low likelihood but high risk events when they do occur. That's a starting place. But I think we've got to evaluate the cost impact associated with outages. That is one of the key data point that goes into a cost benefit analysis. And until we have realistic valuations that we can identify and put into a cost benefit analysis, then we're only going to get so far with really good cost-effective solutions. So I think it's evaluating the cost, and that feeds into understanding what folks are willing to pay. And again, that's a more conceptual comment, but theoretically you can design a system that never goes out or comes back almost instantaneously, but it is cost prohibitive. And some folks understand that, some folks don't. And so it's educating the public and understanding, all right, what's the tolerance for buying down that extra hour or day or whatever that you have when you have an event. Last thing I'll mention is I've frequently heard this a lot right after Hurricane Helene, which was, when the storm comes through and it knocks down the system or whatever, we really need to focus on building back better and addressing the resilience issues that sort of caused the outage to begin with. And I hear that concept, it sounds really neat. Oh yeah, it makes a lot of sense. But then when the lights go off, the focus is getting the lights back on as quickly as possible. We don't have the luxury of, well, let's have everyone sit in the dark for a couple of months as we sort of build a new system or whatever. I do think there's probably some opportunity again, when we've identified our areas where we have recurring issues and we know at some point we're going to have to do this again, to sort of have a plan in place that says, all right, the next time we have to rebuild the substation, we're going to move it here. The next time we have to, rebuild this line, we're going to retool it with this type of equipment as opposed to other, because unless you've got a plan that's ready to go when power needs to be restored, we don't have the time to wait and figure out how to build back better so that we're more resilient next time. You got to rebuild it, and then you've got to come through and have the resilience conversation and then build something else. And again, you're stacking cost at that point. So that's a struggle, but I think we could do a better job of perhaps creatively thinking ahead once we've identified the spots of, how can we somehow build it back, marginally better in different place or location in these spots that we know are problematic.
Excellent synopsis, and I think you captured it. It's easy to use an expression like that. It's more difficult and challenging to aptly implement it. And one thing I think would be excellent if we ever were to do a panel like this again, pull in somebody from Florida to talk about what they do when it comes to hurricanes. I've heard about how they sit there, strategically think about it, make investments that they think will minimize the number of days people will be without power versus believing that people won't be without it at all, just shortening the period of duration. But on that note, what I'd like to do is go ahead and open up the call, open this up for calls from people who may be joining us today as part of this webinar to see if they have any questions of our panelists. And Jessica, I assume you are there to see if there are any hands that might be raised. If we have questions, it would certainly be an appropriate time to entertain them.
Indeed, yes. Thanks, Commissioner. Yeah, we do have one. I will give him the mic. John?
Hi, this is John with the Indiana Utility Consumer Counselor. I was wondering, in our state, we do integrated resource planning where the electric utilities file a 20-year study period for least cost generation mix. What resiliency or reliability metrics do you think would be useful to include in like overall scorecard metrics? Because we kind of just have scorecard with a key metric that summarizes a lot of the conclusions of the analysis. Or just generally connecting this to the integrated resource plans. I'm not sure about Utah or Connecticut, but I believe North Carolina does them. So anyway, thank you.
I don't have the detail in front of me to give you a helpful answer here. But John, I know how to track you down. You being in our counterpart in Indiana, so I've got. Why don't I grab my engineers and connect you up with them who can talk a little more detail about what you've seen in North Carolina that's of interest.
I would appreciate that. Relatively recently, we have like the 5 pillars for electric utility, including reliability, resiliency, and stability. So I think we're all trying to figure out the best way to incorporate that into the long-term planning. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, happy to. I'll connect you. You win the award for stumping the speaker.
Right. I was going to say we have IRPs in Utah, but we don't have any evaluation of resilience or reliability in them. So I have nothing to offer, but now I'm interested in seeing what others are doing.
And in Connecticut, we have an additional challenge. We have our integrated resource plan is done by our Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and our integrated distribution system plan is being led by our Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. And there's certainly lots of collaboration and overlap. But, to get to your point, I think you might have been trying to evaluate, how do resource adequacy decisions feed into resiliency, and that's certainly important. I am also happy to provide links to the straw proposals on performance-based rate making that I referenced, which have the SAIDI, and some more customer-specific metrics around resiliency and reliability, and can get that to Jeff for circulation.
Sounds great. Are there any other questions that we see from those who are attending the webinar today?
Commissioner,
Go
the
ahead,
one thing,
Nicholas.
well, we have a
Oh.
pause. Oh, sorry. I did just want to add, we've been very focused on electric system resiliency, but my office, and I know some other offices and commissions also look out for telecommunication customers. And obviously resiliency plays a huge role in the ability of telecommunications customers to to make sure they have a connection to function in life. And so we try to think about these issues holistically as we're working on electric resilience issues. How will those also impact other customers?
Don't
Sure.
forget water. One thing we saw after Hurricane Helene is entire systems washed away, or at least intakes for water. And I'll bet you Karen Stakowski's on this webinar and she's cheering because water's it's an issue for them as well. Good. That's an excellent point.
I did have a hand raised by Nicholas, but now I'm not seeing that. Nicholas, if you're there, go ahead, please. Maybe he had to drop off.
Okay. And is there one other hand raised? I see something on my screen that might suggest that.
I'm not seeing one. Sorry.
Okay, all right. And
I see a question in the Q&A about gas
Great.
electric interdependency. And
all
gas
right, in the chat,
resilience.
I hadn't reviewed the chat. It looks like there are 4 things in the chat. Go ahead, Chris.
So you're very, very correct to bring up gas as we were talking about telecom and water. So I think so that's more complicated now than it was 5 or 6 years ago, given that gas, historically we weren't generating a lot of electricity out of it. So gas was a heating and cooking component. But now the fact that we're generating so much electricity with gas and the systems are interrelated. I have seen both nationally and here in North Carolina, a lot more discussion about how the gas and electric system interrelates. We saw, with Winter Storm Elliott a few years ago here in North Carolina, where folks drawing gas off to the north caused the pressures in the gas system here running through North Carolina to drop, and we've got CCs and CTs running. It was a peak morning for us. It really put that issue on the radar for us because you can't pile up 3 months of gas the way you can coal and or nuclear the like. So that's a conversation that's starting, but I think the gas resilience is just as important as all the others. So I agree with you flagging that.
Well, and I want to concur that it's important. And I would say that perhaps in our region, we've had more gas generating units than maybe yours. So I feel like we've been talking about it for many years. But I also think I have not seen anything that I could recommend to others in terms of a good evaluation of gas resilience. To me, it feels a lot like you have to do this for safety and security and resilience without the supporting documentation that all of us have been talking about with cost-ben. So I think there's a long way to go in the gas industry.
Well, and like in North Carolina, we're vertically integrated. So, as an electric utility, you're responsible for procuring your fuel and generating your electricity and putting it out through your LDC, or through your distribution system. In the gas sector, we're dependent upon Transco to go get the gas out of the Gulf or Marcellus Shell or something and get it down here to North Carolina, and then our LDCs take it off and run it through their system. So there's just more moving parts there on the gas side in terms of supply. And then if you're trying to route it then through to electric company who's then going to generate electricity to it and run it out to homes and hospitals and the like, that's just more moving parts. Which I think underscores the need to really map out those hotspots that are more likely to be a problem in the event we have one of these low probability, high risk events.
And of course, after that Winter Storm Elliott, Duke decided that they wanted proposed to increase the reserve margin from 17% to 22%,
right,
to take into account all the things that might go wrong, along with increased demand that was occurring in this time frame. on that note, I'm not seeing any other questions. What I'd like to do is to give each of you a chance to kind of summarize your thoughts about the particular issues and add any additional perspective or insight that you have not added previously, and we'll kind of wind things out for today. And Chris, since you're on my screen, I'll go ahead and recognize you first.
Well, I appreciate the discussion and the ability to participate. Look, this is a tough issue, and as I mentioned earlier, it seems like every major high impact, low probability event that we have, each one is materially different from another. And so you take a step back and you're like, all right, well, what could we have done differently? And you adjust, but then the next event is materially different. Might be similar, but it's also materially different, so that whatever plan that you came up with didn't necessarily match up and prevent either prevent the outage or allow you to bounce back as quickly as you wanted to. And so I think the ability to maintain flexibility in our system operations, and frankly, the ability to interconnect and call on our neighbors, whether it is for electrons or whether it's for staff to help come in and get systems reconnected and built back up, I think is going to be critical to responding to what seems to be a steady flow of resilience type events that impacts an ever increasingly large and sensitive system that we built and depend on. So appreciate the discussion, and look forward to digging into a couple of the ideas on metrics and scorecards and the like that I heard from Claire and Michelle.
Excellent. Michelle, would you like to go ahead and?
Sure. Let me start by thanking you, Commissioner, for your moderation today, and thanking NARUC for the invitation. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet is collaboration. I think that in Utah so far, it's where our focus has been in these highly contested dockets in front of the commission. And I really like to think about the potential for better outcomes if we could have more collaborative processes, because I just think that you can reach different outcomes when you're working outside of that highly contested case in front of the commission. So I want to speak to that. And then also I want to say that although there's a lot of new processes, and certainly, I'm kind of in awe of Claire and Connecticut and everything they're doing, there aren't that many new principles. It's still protecting customers still comes down to the cost ben, I think. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And Claire, you'll have the last word.
Sure, thank you. Honored to have the last word, and I have really appreciated the discussion and the ability to join you today. So thank you. I'll hit off or two of the points that Michelle made. I definitely agree. At the end of the day, the benefit cost analysis is sort of where the heart of decision making is, and this is a particularly challenging area to figure out. Both the costs, as Chris was saying, they change every storm, and the benefits, because we don't know how resiliency measures are, going to, result in reduced outages or reduced recovery expenses, for example. So this is sort of like an insurance program, right? That we're evaluating, whether how much we are willing to pay in exchange for the hope that will reduce outages. So it's a very challenging prospect, and I think the best we can do is to plan, and use metrics and criteria, and really try to make these evidence-based decisions. And I do agree with Michelle that collaboration is key. Our integrated distribution system planning process, our resiliency planning framework, those were all done in uncontested dockets. And we've had the ability to have, roundtables where utility representatives and other stakeholders come in to discuss these issues, because they're tough. There's not necessarily black and white solutions. So having real conversations does produce better results.
Excellent. Well, let me thank all three of you for serving as panelists this afternoon. I'd like to thank NARUC and NSUCA for pulling this webinar together. And I would refer everybody back to that NARUC Resilience Framework publication that they did. It provides excellent food for thought when you combine that with the perspectives and thoughts that were shared with you this afternoon in this webinar, it gives you something as a springboard to think about and work from in doing resiliency planning. And more importantly, considering those costs and benefits, doing the modeling, and identifying uniquely in each jurisdiction what those priorities should be. On that note, thank you all that were part of this webinar. Thank you as well in terms of those that joined us as a part of this webinar. I think we had at one point close to about 100 people participating. So for all of you that joined us this afternoon, thank you for sharing a portion of your afternoon with us. And on that note, we'll return the rest of your afternoon to you. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
y'all.